4 or 5 years ago, with a very dry summer, the lagoon dropped and you could actually walk out almost to where that shadow, we can see there's this shiny sort of black part. Back in against the Rapu, just down here, the side of that corner, there were 3 stumps, and they were about a foot through, and they were sharp. They were just like a sharpened pencil.
That's intriguing that there's stumps preserved on the lake floor.
I did have a cut at them with my pocket knife,
Yeah.
and the wood was quite hard.
A really interesting way of getting an age, and radiocarbon dated it.
Well,
Then we
that's
could
right.
give you an age.
I thought, or presumed, that it was probably white pine growing down here.
There is a lot of rimu, but there is also kakatea or white pine in the pollen record, so that's consistent with what we observe. When we're looking at the sedimentary record in the lake, so this is the sediments that accumulate on the bottom, it provides us with a bit of a window in time to reconstruct what has happened. But there's nothing like getting it from people who were actually here and observed it, so it's a real treat for me actually.
Yeah.
Here we are on the edge of Lake Nganoke, which is in the southern Wairarapa plain to the east of the Ruamahanga River. This is a small lake, but it's a really important lake for Lakes 380 because it archives years of land use change and the influence that that land use change over that time has had on both the lake ecosystem, the organisms living in the lake, and also the water quality. The way we sample these lakes to get our sediment cores is we rode out to the deepest spot, the depot centre, and we picked the depot centre because that's where all the sediment is focused, so we get the most complete record of the processes that have been happening in the lake and its catchment. And from that site we took 4 1.5 metre long sediment cores, which get us back 1,000 years into the past, and indeed at this site to when the lake actually first formed. And that history is archived in the lake, along with information on how that history has influenced the lake ecosystem, the organisms living in the lake, and importantly for us, the quality of the water in the lake. When Māori started using the landscape, we see in the pollen record an increase in charcoal, which is evidence of burning, an increase in bracken fern, which is a coloniser of those parts of the landscape that have been burnt. But really interestingly, only a very marginal reduction in the abundance of pollen from the native vegetation, the tall trees, which is indicative of fire probably being used as a tool to access parts of the landscape as opposed to whole-scale clearance. One of the really interesting findings from Lake Nganoke is that when Māori first settled, we see an increase in the lake marginal plants, in particular raupo. Now, as these lake marginal plants expanded, they actually shielded the lake from flux of nutrients and sediments from its catchment. And what we actually see over the period of time that Māori were utilising the landscape is an increase in the water quality, which is indicated by a reduction in the abundance of algae and the chlorophyll A that they leave in our sediment record. What's really interesting is when we start seeing Europeans convert this landscape for agriculture, and in particular the use of superphosphate fertiliser, which we can track the use of in our lake cores. And what we see over that European period of agriculture is as superphosphate application increases, we see an increase in algal productivity and chlorophyll A, and in particular after World War II, when the advent of industrial agriculture really took off and the application rates of superphosphate and indeed the stocking rates on the land increased. One of the really interesting things about Lake Nganoke is the fact that actually its catchment, and indeed most of the lake marginal area, has been fenced off and planted with riparian planting. That happened from around about the late 50s onwards. Now, unfortunately, despite all of that planting, we still see that the lake water quality has been on a declining trajectory over that time. So we wouldn't say that the riparian planting has not had a positive effect, but it hasn't been sufficient to actually limit the decline in lake water quality, at least over the last 40 years.
Well, that was fenced off on that side before I took over, but we've certainly fenced all around this. And during the summer, we'd have to come around here every evening because when the water level went down, the sheep would be trying to get a drink, and there would be an odd one stuck in the mud, and you have to pull them out. And it took a bit of pulling out sometimes because the sheep with a bit of wool on it and a whole lot of mud was pretty heavy. In some places the mud was deep enough that even cattle got stuck, and an odd horse. We did that to, keep stock out of the mud, but also to provide a bit of shelter for the ducks. The duck population was much higher than what it is now, so we gave them a bit of shelter when there were strong southerlies. Yeah, the fences lasted till now. It's getting a bit shaky, but still keeping the stock out.
Before you were able to have articulated water in troughs, this was the main place that the stock would come to drink?
For around these paddocks around here, it was the only place they had. And in the summer when it got pretty hot and that, it tended to upset them. So it wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing.
And so by upsetting them, was it like a stomach?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So did the lake change colour and things in the summer? Was there an algal bloom or something like that you could see?
It did get a bit off colour, yes.
At least over the time that Holmes has been on the property, the lake can host up to a couple of thousand waterfowl during the duck shooting season. And that's something that we've been mindful of, actually particularly in the pre-human part of the record when waterfowl abundance in New Zealand was much higher, and that has been an explanation that we've been thinking about for explaining the high algal productivity before humans arrived. And what we're going to do actually is use environmental DNA and a primer that actually selects for avian DNA such that we can actually quantify the abundance of waterfowl on the lake over the last 1,000 years. And that is a way of testing the hypothesis that it might not just be the land use that's driving the processes that we see in the lake. So certainly looking at the abundance of waterfowl through time on a lake as small as Lake Nganoke will be important.
I've always been sort of quite fascinated with the bird life, and I'm a keen duck shooter, but I've enjoyed seeing whatever else is around. There is a variety here. If you want to look for it. Well, we of course never shot on this. My grandfather said, well, when he came here, there was plenty of shooting down around the lake, and it wasn't a very marvellous place to shoot. It was a bit hard to get the ducks, and they didn't have boats and so forth, so it wasn't worth shooting the birds and not picking them up. And so he said, well, we won't shoot on it. And we've really enjoyed the bird life, and got more out of it than what we would have by actually shooting.